We're back to our story. This will be our third night of reading it, and we're going to begin on page 82. T. Davis Bond's The Quilt. It was 2 days later, early enough in the morning for the ladies to have cut a dark swath across the dew-covered lawn as they arrived. The sitting room smelled of coffee and baking bread, and was surprisingly silent for the number of people sitting on chairs, floor, and footstools. A couple were humming, and one was staring out into space with a little smile on her face, and 3 were on their hands and knees around Mary's chair as they discussed the color coding in whispers. The room's stillness was too precious a gift to be disturbed with loud voices and unnecessary chatter. Luann raised herself up from the tiny space behind the television and walked over to Mary. In her hands was a parchment-colored sheet of brittle paper. "Miss Mary, did you write this?" Mary looked up from the myriad of triangular fabrics in her lap. "What have you got there, sister?" Luann held out the sheet. Said, "Did you used to write poetry, Miss Mary?" Mary took the paper and examined it. A tremor seemed to pass over her body. "Land's sakes," she whispers. Luann bent nearer. "You've gone all white, Miss Mary. Are you all right?" Mary looked up, said in a fragile voice, "Where on earth did you find this?" Luann made a frightened little gesture back behind her. "I was just looking through your old Bibles, Miss Mary. I was reading the passages you had marked, just turning the pages, and I found this sheet." She gave the old woman a very worried look. "I'm real sorry if I shouldn't have done it. Are you all right?" "Everything's just fine, child," Mary said quietly, and turned away from a room full of watching faces. She stared out the window a long time, long enough for worried glances to be passed back and forth among her guests. Mary turned back, saw that Luann really was concerned, smiled with a warmth that was all her own, and patted the stool beside her chair. "Sit down here for a moment, honey, and I'll tell you why it gave me such a start." "I'm really sorry, Miss Mary. It was just so beautiful, and I thought—" Shh, honey. There's nothing wrong with what you've done. It just startled me. I haven't seen this in, I don't know how many years, not since before Everett was born." When Luann was settled, Mary went on. "Between Jonas and Everett, I had 3 other babies. The first 2 were stillborn, God rest their little souls. The 3rd was my only little girl. She was the smilingest little baby you ever saw. That's about all I can remember about her now. That and the way she would follow me with her eyes all over the room. I know it's not possible. No baby a month old can do it, but that's the way it was. Got no reason to fib about it now, do I? I would walk into the room and her little face would just light up like a candle. She'd lie there too tiny to move anything more than her head, and she'd follow me with her eyes no matter where I went. And if I went out and came back in again, that little darling was still watching the door. Soon as she saw me, she'd smile again. Happiest baby I ever did see. Hardly ever cried, and if she did, all I had to do was pick her up and she'd settle right down. Little angel was all she was." Mary sighed long and soft, shook her head. Came in one morning when she was just 4 months old and found her lying there dead, crib death, the doctor told me. Nothing anybody could have done about it. Like to have torn me apart, losing my little girl. Don't know a body could stand that much grief and still survive. The room was so silent that the mockingbird outside the sitting room window sounded jarringly loud. All eyes watched Mary turn and stare out the window, hiding the emotions that etched the ancient face, searching the sunlit lawn for a smiling little girl. Dr. Caswell was preacher then, Mary went on, her face still pointed toward the window. None of you would remember him, but there was a fine man, a good man, never afraid to share a body's burdens. Don't know what would have happened to me if it wasn't for him. One time he came by. I suppose it must have been a few months after the funeral. Dr. Caswell gave me that sheet there and told me the story of George Matheson. Have any of you ladies ever heard of him? There was a chorus of no ma'ams about the room as work was forgotten, tools laid aside, bodies settled to more comfortable positions. George Matheson was a man of the Lord, born and raised in Scotland. I forget when he lived, but I know it wasn't in this century. He fell in love with a beautiful young lady, and they planned to marry. Not long before his wedding day, George Matheson discovered he was going blind. Mary waited until the room quieted, then continued. He did what he had to do, went to his young lady and told her the news, told her she could break off the engagement if she wanted, and that he still loved her and wanted to marry if she would have him. The woman thought about it for several days, then came back and said that though she loved him, she did not want to spend the rest of her life with the blind man. And the wedding was off. Soon after this, George Matheson wrote a hymn. Mary turned back from the window. She lifted the brittle page with trembling hands, looked at it for a long moment, then handed it over to Luann. Her voice was shaky as her hands when she said, "Read that first verse for me, honey. My eyes aren't what they used to be." Luann studied the ancient script and read in a halting voice, "O love that wilt not let me go, I rest my weary soul in thee. I give thee back the life I owe, that in thine ocean's depths its flow may richer, fuller be." The Lord holds me always in his love, Dr. Caswell told me. Mary said to the silent room, always there, always loving, always giving, always healing. At my weakest, the Lord is strongest. Mary paused a moment, kneading one hand with the other, then said, "George Matheson went blind, and he didn't marry the girl. He lived a full life for his Lord, and toward the end of his time on earth, he wrote a prayer. I think more than anything, these words were what saw me through my own dark times." She looked at Luann and said, "Just read that section there at the bottom that starts, 'My God,' please, child." Luann cleared her throat, wiped her eyes, and read, "My God, I have never thanked thee for my thorn. I have thanked thee 1,000 times for my roses, but never once for my thorn. Teach me the glory of my cross. Teach me the value of my thorn. Show me that I have climbed to thee by the path of my pain. Show me that my tears have made my rainbows." "There's lessons right there along to the end of the road," Mary said, her eyes back on the window. She sighed, shook her head, said softly to the world outside, "What strength that man must have had." Pretty soon the whole town was talking about the quilt. Give or take a few souls who didn't think the whole mess amounted to a hill of beans on a hot day. The regular crew was singled out for talk and gossip, the opinions varying according to personalities. For some it was a curious thing how grown-up women with jobs and families could see fit to spend so much time on a silly old quilt. Others thought it a Christian duty helping poor Miss Mary out on something she had no business starting in the first place. Then there were some who heard of the praying and the Bible reading and the singing, but they weren't really sure they could believe it all. Others listened and nodded and wished in silence they had the courage and the time to go up and join the group. When asked, those who went were usually very excited about it, yet bashful at the same time. It was hard to describe the communion and the joy and the stillness they found in that little house on the hill. Some of those who went regularly stopped saying much when asked about it, or at least stopped opening their hearts every time someone asked them how the quilt was getting on. It was hard to face those frozen little know-it-all smiles, those calculating cold eyes beneath carefully set coiffures, that unspoken desire to probe for weakness and fault and something to criticize. So the women often did what they felt they had to, which was develop a little two-sentence piece that started out with how marvelous it was to take time for prayer every day, and ended with how the lady ought to come up and join them. And the lady would cover her disappointment at not gaining anything else for her rumor mill with another little cold-eyed smile, and say the inevitable, "Miss Mary is such a beautiful woman," and change the subject. The morning session in Mary's sitting room took on the sort of established routine that was possible only when people did what they needed to do because they wanted to. The first ladies to arrive each morning made coffee and set out the various scissors and measuring tapes and sewing baskets. If a pie or coffee cake was brought, it was put in the oven and the temperature set on low. Bread dough was placed on the counter to rise and covered with a damp cloth. The women chatted with Mary and marked out the work completed the day before, and laughed quite a lot. There was a sense of anticipation in the room, a feeling that the little girl inside each of them was let loose to laugh and chase sunbeams and share a little of the joy they thought locked away forever. Most mornings the ladies would only stay an hour and then hurry back to what they had come to call the outside world. Mary would see them all off the way she greeted them, with a soft smile and a blessing and a few words to show how wonderful it was to have them stop by. The ladies would always hesitate by the door, feeling pushed to go, regretting that they were leaving, and sort of wondering down deep if maybe that push they were feeling to depart was not truly as urgent as they made it out to be. Every few minutes Mary would remind them of their purpose, their responsibility to say a prayer of thanks with each stitch sewn. "It doesn't matter if this quilt takes another 20 years, Mary would say a dozen times a day. What is important is that we all, each and every one of us, remember what it's like to be grateful. That morning Jody waited until the room was pretty full, then said she had something she wanted to talk about. She found she couldn't address the room directly with the shyness she hadn't known for years. She turned to Mary and talked, though her words were meant for all the room. "I found the prettiest Bible passage last night, Mama," Jody said. Lately Mary had been spending more and more time just sitting and looking out the window, the work laying unattended in her lap. She turned at the sound of her name, blinked a few times as though not remembering where she was or why the people were there, and said, "What's that, child?" "A Bible passage I found last night," Jody said, feeling somehow very young and embarrassed. "Isn't that nice?" Mary said, bringing the room into focus with her smile. "Why don't you read it for us?" "Yes, ma'am." Jody opened her Bible and said, "It's from the 100th Psalm. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations." "I've always loved that passage," Mary said, nodding her head very slowly, as though the effort was almost too much for her. "Why don't you tell us how that spoke to your heart?" "Well," Jody said, patting a wayward hair with movements made jerky by her nervousness, "I just read it and kind of saw myself walking into the presence of the Lord, like it says, and the way I could do it was by praising his name." She made a little gesture as if she were trying to grab words out of the air, searching to find a way to say it so that the emotion she had felt would live for the others. It was so beautiful there, with this love and light and everything, and I saw how all the things that I worried about were shadows that kept me from seeing what I really needed to, which was to be thankful. Mary waited until she was sure Jody was finished and said softly, "Child, you don't know how those words make me feel." With visible effort, Mary rose to her feet, and the room saw that the lady could not stand upright. She leaned over slightly, her arm bent up like a broken chicken wing. She held it close to her side, pressing in to keep some unseen pain from escaping and submerging her, and those in the room felt their hearts stand still. Jody was up and beside her before Mary could take her first step. "Mama, what's the matter?" "Be an angel and help me back to the bedroom," Mary said. "Can we get you something?" Luann asked. "Not a thing, thank you. You just sit there and think on what this child has told you." Mary let herself be half led, half carried through the silent room. When she was in the doorway leading to the back hall, she turned and said to them all, "And finish what you started." That afternoon Mary had not risen from her bed, and her color did not look good, so Jody decided it was time to listen to sense and not to Mary's protest. She called the doctor, and when he heard who it was, he promised to stop by on his way home. Dr. Horace Martin had the sort of bedside manner that made most people want to get well just to make him happy, and those who couldn't will themselves well were grateful for his care. His eyes held the light of somebody who was just waiting to hear the punchline of a really good joke, and even on the coldest days his hands somehow stayed warm. He had forgotten more secrets than most people ever knew, and came close to matching the minister for hearing out people's troubles. But his face was serious and his eyes grave when he finished Mary's examination. He folded up his stethoscope and put it back into his little black bag before saying, "Miss Mary, I think maybe I ought to call us a car to take you over to the hospital." Jody felt that little cloud of fear that had been hovering around her all day densifying to a solid lump of ice that settled in her belly. She reached out and grasped the door jamb for support. Mary did not need to raise her voice to get the message across. "Horace Martin, you are going to do no such thing." "It's just a few tests, Miss Mary. There's nothing. Don't be silly, young man." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but her gaze still brooked no back talk. "What on earth do I need tests for? I'm old and I'm sick. There, I've just saved us both a lot of trouble." Dr. Horace Martin knew Mary well enough to quit while he was able. He gave her hand a little pat, smiled in defeat, stood and signaled for Jody and Luann to follow him out. Once the door was closed, Jody had to fight to keep her voice steady as she asked, "Is she going to be all right?" There were some things that Horace Martin had never become comfortable with. His eyes said one thing while his voice said another. "She's old, but she's strong. Why don't we give her a couple of days and see how it develops?" Jody was too numb to wring her hands. "Should I try to talk her into going to the hospital?" It showed the kind of man Dr. Horace Martin truly was when he fought down his first reaction and said instead, "Maybe the best thing for her right now is to stay where she's most comfortable." By mid-morning of the next day, Mary's front sitting room was jammed. Luann had been there since letting the kids off at school, granting Jody a chance to go home and get a few hours' sleep. Voices were even more hushed than usual. Just before lunch, Luann went back to find Mary's eyes open. "Are you all right, Mama? Can I get you something to eat?" Mary motioned toward the glass on her bedstead. When Luann had helped her drink, she asked, "Are they working on my quilt?" The question caught Luann by surprise. "Why, yes, ma'am. That is, you march right back out there and tell them to remember what I said." Mary's voice carried surprising strength for being so soft. "Not a stitch is to be sewn without a prayer of thanks." "Yes, Mama, I will, but don't you want right this instant, young lady," Mary said, and set her mouth in firm lines. When Luann was by the door, she added, "And you might just call Preacher Lewis and ask him to stop by sometime." Preacher Lewis was a wisp of a man with the voice of a hurricane, rolling and thundering and shaking the rafters. People who'd never seen him preach wondered how such a small, weak-looking man with watery gray eyes could ride herd on such a large congregation. The question was never voiced by anyone who'd sat through a Sunday morning with Preacher Lewis. As one old-timer put it, there was no question where the power came from. Up at the altar, the man burned like a freshly lit Coleman cooking stove. The setting room was still full of ladies that evening when the preacher arrived. Outside in the twilight, a cluster of husbands and older children were talking in the low voices of people accustomed to the gatherings of a death watch. Preacher Lewis greeted the men with his mild voice, commented on how warm the evening had remained, and pushed his way through the screen door. He stopped on the threshold and stared over the silent group with gentle gray eyes showing surprise. Women intent on work raised their heads to the Reverend and offered greetings, but little was said and less time lost as they continued with their slow, careful stitching. Jody and Luann came up together. The Reverend looked at them and said, "Don't these ladies have families waiting?" "We've been trying to get them to go home for almost 4 hours now," Jody said. "They'll leave for a little while and then sneak back in." "Lynn told me straight out that if I locked the door she'd break in a window," Luann said. "I would too," Lynn affirmed from her place by the frame. "Miss Mary told us to finish this, and that's exactly what we're going to do." "Tell her we're not forgetting the prayers, Reverend," Amy said from where she was finishing up her own circular pattern. "Yes, well, perhaps I best speak to Miss Mary." Preacher Lewis allowed himself to be led through the women and down the back hallway to the bedroom. He smiled his thanks to Jody and Luann and shut the door in their faces. More than an hour passed before the minister reappeared. He went with Jody and Luann into the kitchen, refused their offer of coffee, spent a long moment tracing the pattern in the tablecloth. "Might as well say it, Reverend," Luann said, blinking at tears. "It's clear enough in your face." Reverend Lewis raised his eyes, studied the two faces carefully before smiling his thin little smile and saying, "That is one beautiful lady." "What did she say?" Jody pressed. "Miss Mary told me it was time she was going home," Reverend Lewis replied. When Jody could talk again, she said, "Oh, dear sweet Lord." "Said it like she was talking about the price of eggs," Reverend Lewis said. "She had a message for you, too. Said I was to wait, but I think maybe I'll tell you now. She said for you both to be strong." Work on the quilt became a 24-hour affair. Ladies whose husbands worked the night shift would come by for an hour or so, only to find a few others who just couldn't sleep and thought maybe they'd stop in and keep Jody or Luann or Jonas company. Nobody noticed Everett. He had come in not long after the preacher, had left, and had not moved since. He remained camped out in the chair beside Mary's bed, not saying anything except when he read to her. He slept in little snatches when his eyes wouldn't stay open anymore, the Bible open in his lap in case Mary woke and wanted to hear something. As soon as she closed her eyes again, though, he'd stop his reading and just sit there and watch her. When Jonas came in the first time, he started to ask his brother to leave them alone for a moment, but when he saw the look in Everett's eyes, he just didn't have the heart to say anything. Luann brought Everett food every once in a while, then stood over him to make sure he ate. Just before dawn on the 5th day after Preacher Lewis's visit, the last stitch was made. 7 tired ladies stepped back from the upright frame and looked with pleased expressions on their work. It was a glorious quilt. The outer edges were framed in shiny swatches of multicolored satin. They gave way to a stretch of pastel blue as clear and soft as the morning sky, and against this background were set the circular flower patterns. Radiating out from each inner circle were 14 petals, and each pattern was made from 4 different materials, 4 different printed designs. Somehow the different colors and designs and prints melted together and formed a new, larger pattern. The older ladies who had done quilts before knew this was the key. If the patterns were in true harmony, they were seen yet not seen, like each brush stroke of a painting was not seen separately from the whole. The quilt was a picture and a story. It was a testimony to a time when pressures did not cry out for urgent things to be constantly tended to, when the world had not created 1,000 different temptations pulling free time into a myriad of mindless activities. It told of values and patience and timeless meanings. It drew the person in. It spoke of comfort and rest. It soothed with the gentleness of a mother's kiss. Jonas arrived with the sun, bringing the doctor for his morning visit. The 2 men stopped in front of the upright frame as though drawn to the spot. "That is a work of art," Dr. Martin said. "You ladies should be proud of yourselves." "Too tired to be proud," Jody said, smiling at her husband. "I'm not," Amy said. "I'm so proud I could burst. I want to take that frame apart and put it back together in Mary's room," Jonas decided. "Want her to see it just like this." "You better wait till Lou Ann gets here," Jody said. "She'd skin you alive if she wasn't here to watch Mama's face." "You get busy with that then," Dr. Martin said. "I'll go see to our patient. Everett's still in there." "Hasn't moved in 5 days," Jody said, the light in her eyes dimming. "I went in a couple of hours ago and covered him with a blanket. Mama seemed to be resting comfortably." It took them the better part of the morning to unfasten the quilt, take the screws out of the frame's corners, and set it up again in Mary's room. They had to wait until they were sure she was asleep before starting to rebuild it. While they worked, they kept shooting little glances at each other, raising up a little, looking at the bed, half grinning at the thought of what Mary would say, making a lot of noise in a quiet sort of way, and just generally acting like kids getting ready to surprise their parents. Everybody who didn't work stood in the doorway and watched, or waited in the sitting room to greet the newcomers and watch their expressions as they saw the quilt spread out across Mary's chair. Most everybody had seen it the day before, but this was different. It was finished. The extra stitches had been cut away, all the little slivers of material brushed aside, the floor vacuumed, the quilt laid out for all to see. People came in and were cautioned to silence on account of the door to the back room being open. Then those already there would kind of shuffle aside so the newcomers could see the quilt. There was a little gasp of inward breath, a little step forward with outstretched hand, a moment of silence, and the words everybody had been waiting to hear. It was a glorious quilt. Finally the frame was built up again, and the quilt was taken and set into place. By this time the door was jammed so tight with bodies that those in the back couldn't see a thing. Everett sat in the chair by the bed, watching it all with eyes that didn't seem to be seeing very much, so quiet and still that after a moment nobody really thought much about him being there. The side clamps were tightened and the frame was raised upright, barely fitting in under the ceiling, and another little gasp escaped from the people by the door. The sound woke Mary. She turned her head slowly toward the noise, and it took a moment for her to realize how many people were there. Then she caught sight of the quilt out of the corner of her eye and swiveled her head back upright. Mary reached a fragile hand out toward Everett and said in an ancient voice, "Hand me my glasses, son." "It's done, Mama," Jody said, so excited she could barely stand it. At those words, the crowd outside pushed the ones in front forward, and more than a dozen people spilled into the room. They moved over toward the bed headboard so as to see the quilt as Mary did, and the sight was really something. What with the quilt almost big enough to cover the entire back wall, Luann helped Jody slide another pillow under Mary's head so she could see it better. Grins kept popping up all over the room. They'd look from the quilt back to Mary and back to the quilt again, and then show another little grin to their neighbor. Mary looked at it for a long time, for a long, long time. She looked at it for so long that people started getting little lumps in their throats, watching her look at the quilt, thinking about how everybody said it would never get done, remembering how they themselves had labored over this or that, recalling the work, recalling the prayers. Truly it was a glorious quilt. Finally, Mary turned to look over the friends and family gathered there in her room. She held them there for a moment, returning their smiles and shining eyes with a gaze that seemed to reach deep inside. With visible effort, Mary raised her head up and said with surprising strength, "Now all of you go out there and finish what you've started." Despite the fact that she was close to being scared out of her wits, Jody went up to the altar alone the morning of Mary's funeral. Luann helped her work out what she was going to say, and there was no way Luann could leave Everett alone just then, especially not at the funeral. Jonas just plain turned and walked away. When Jody pressed him, all he said was, "The last time you got me to stand up in front of other people was at our wedding. I don't aim on making a fool of myself twice in one life." Lynn said she'd go up there with her, but she kind of felt in her heart like it was something Jody needed to do alone. Jody was held back from pressing her best friend by the fact that she felt in her heart that Lynn was right. The church was filled to capacity that morning, was how Reverend Lewis put it. The back and side doors were all open to the early summer sun, but any breeze that might have been there to cool off the flock was blocked by the crowd pushing for room to see. Those who got there early enough had a place in the pews and busied themselves fanning up meager puffs of air with hats and programs and prayer book bindings. The others crowded in a semicircle around the outer walls, content to lean and shift their weight and perch their children up on the windowsills. The only people who weren't crowded were those in the front 2 rows and the choir. The choir suffered, as all choirs do in stuffy summer churches, berobed and chafing and hoping their sweat didn't drip on the hymnals. Those in the front 2 rows would have simply given the world to be anywhere but where they were. Reverend Lewis led the congregation through a hymn and a prayer and a short talk about women everybody knew, and all the while gave the little white terry cloth towel he carried in his pocket a real good workout. He thought of something he'd have to share with his wife once it was all over, which was that one could have found more breathing space in an unopened can of sardines than there in that church. By the time Jody got up, the church was one big fidget. A basket full of week-old puppies would have been calmer. She had a time finding the place in her Bible, what with the perspiration in her eyes and the clammy feeling that left her fingers clumsy. To keep the trembling from showing, Jody slid one finger on the page and grabbed that hand with the other and squeezed. She looked up at the crowd and tried to speak above the fretful babies and the rustling fans and the quiet noise that a crowd makes when it's ready to get up and out, but is too polite to say so. "I know it's going to sound a little crazy to read a passage of thanks at Mama's funeral," Jody began, and found herself getting all choked up. It was kind of strange because she hadn't really felt that much grief during the past 24 hours. The day before yesterday had been touch and go, but yesterday hadn't been too bad. There had been one moment in the bathroom last night when she was afraid she was going to drop her youngest. She started crying so hard, and that had scared the poor little one so bad she'd been forced to get control over herself. After that, she'd been pretty much okay until she was in bed with Jonas, and then the good man had to rock her to sleep like a little girl. Jody swallowed real hard and made her eyelids flutter and pinched her hand real good and fought back the burning behind her eyes. She went on. But all of us who knew Mama knew she would never want anything else. This passage comes from Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again. Rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Jody raised her eyes from the book and saw that the church had settled. Her own nervousness was lessening, the pressure in her throat totally gone. There's a lot I could say about the mother of my husband, Jody began. The lady the world knows as Miss Mary, and who became as close to me as my own mother, but it would just be repeating what you already know. So I'll say what Mama would want me to say, and that is to give thanks to the Lord your God every day. She taught me a lot, more than I could ever say to anybody. But this last lesson of hers is the one I'll fight hardest to keep. It truly is the way of knowing the peace that surpasses all understanding. Everybody who came to Mary's little house on the hill after the service stopped by to tell Jody how well she did. It wasn't just nice, someone said. It was like something I'd expect to have Mary say, wise and sweet and short. Somebody else told her just the thing that Mary would want said. You've given me something to carry with me for a long time, another friend said. One last little gift from Mary. Lynn came up as she was refilling the punch bowl and said, Better watch out, honey. There's a delegation in the corner over there ready to put you up for Mary's place. Now that it was over, the hole was back in Jody's heart. She struggled to make a smile. She struggled to make a smile and said, They've got to be scraping the bottom of the barrel then. I don't know, Lynn said, wearing the same smile she'd had since the service. It really was a little like Miss Mary, the way you stood up there and talked from the heart. Jody decided it was time to change the subject. She pointed with her chin toward the quilt stand and said, Just look at that, will you? The back wall of Mary's sitting room was hidden by the upright quilt frame. It dominated the room, drawing every eye toward it as soon as the outer door was opened. It was as though the reason for the gathering had to be put aside until the newcomer had gotten up close to that quilt, touched it, admired it, talked to a couple of neighbors about it, gotten lost for a moment in the beauty of the design. Every lag in the conversation was filled with a comment about the quilt. It's hard to believe I ever worked on anything that pretty, Lynn agreed. I wish there was some way you could see the prayers we sewed into it, Jody said, mostly to herself. Lynn looked around the room, saw the sadness leave faces as they looked back to the quilt. She turned toward the back wall, saw her neighbors wipe away tears, and smiled as they reached out and touched the circular flowers. She patted Jody's arm and said, Maybe you can. I hope you enjoyed that story. I'll find another one to read you someday. God bless you all. Be thankful for everything, even the thorns.